I'm 73 years old, and for 35 years I fed something in the woods behind my cabin that the world says doesn't exist. His name was Samuel, at least that's what I called him. And 3 months ago, on a frozen February morning, he died in my arms, while the first light of dawn broke through the Douglas firs above us. But before he took his last breath, before his massive chest went still and his eyes clouded over with the finality of death, he did something I will never forget. Something that shattered everything I thought I understood about his kind. He spoke. Not in grunts or howls like the researchers claim on those late-night documentaries. Not in the wood knocks and distant screams they record on expensive equipment and analyze frame by frame. He spoke in broken English, with a voice like gravel sliding down a mountainside, rough and ancient, and filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. And he told me why his kind hides from us, why they've always hidden, for thousands of years, melting into forests and mountains and the forgotten places where humans don't go. When I understood what he was saying, when the terrible truth of it settled into my bones, I wept for him. I wept for all of them, and I've been weeping, in one way or another, ever since. I live alone now, 10 miles outside the town of Skycomish, Washington, on the western edge of the Cascade Mountains, where the old-growth forest still stands thick and dark and primordial. My cabin sits at the end of a logging road that hasn't been used since the mill shut down in 1991, when the timber industry collapsed and left half the town unemployed. The road is barely visible now, swallowed by salal and sword ferns and blackberry vines that grow so thick you'd need a machete to get through. The forest here is ancient: Douglas fir, western red cedar, and western hemlock. Trees so tall they block out the sun even at noon, creating a perpetual twilight that smells like wet bark and moss and the slow rot of fallen logs. The silence is absolute. No neighbors for miles, no cars, no voices, just the wind moving through the canopy 300 feet above and the distant rush of the Skycomish River cutting through the valley below. I moved here in 1987, a year after my husband Richard died of a heart attack, while mowing the lawn on a Saturday morning in our suburban Seattle home. I was 40 years old, angry at the world, angry at God, angry at the neat little life I'd built that had been ripped away in an instant. I sold everything: the house, the furniture, Richard's truck, and bought 20 acres of forest and a rotting hunting cabin for less than the cost of a used car. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to stop being Margaret Thornhill, widow, former elementary school teacher, woman who cried in the cereal aisle at Safeway. I wanted to become no one, and I did. For a year I saw no one, spoke to no one except the clerk at the general store when I drove into town once a month for supplies. I chopped wood until my hands bled and blistered and finally calloused over. I hauled water from the creek in 5-gallon buckets. I read by kerosene lamp at night, old paperbacks I found in boxes in the cabin, mysteries and westerns and romances that someone else had left behind. I thought I was alone out here. I thought the only living things watching me were deer and black bears and maybe the occasional cougar passing through. I was wrong. It started in the spring of 1988, late April, when the trilliums were blooming white in the understory, and the vine maples were unfurling their new leaves. I'd been setting out scraps from dinner on the back porch: leftover venison stew, the heel of a loaf of cornbread, apple cores and carrot peelings, not for anything in particular, just out of habit. My grandmother back in Kentucky used to do the same thing on her back porch in the Appalachian foothills, said it was respectful to share with the forest, that the land would take care of you if you took care of it. I didn't really believe that, but I did it anyway. It felt like keeping a connection to her, to a time when the world made sense. One morning I woke just after dawn and went out to retrieve the bowl. It was empty. That wasn't unusual. Raccoons, possums, even ravens would clean up scraps overnight. But the wooden porch rail was splintered. A section of it cracked clean through as if something enormous had leaned its weight against it. And there, in the soft mud beside the porch steps where I'd watered my pathetic attempt at a vegetable garden, was a handprint. Not a paw print, a handprint. 5 fingers, an opposable thumb. The print was 18 inches long from the base of the palm to the tip of the longest finger. The depth of it suggested something that weighed at least 400 pounds, maybe more. I knelt there in my nightgown, the morning mist cold against my skin, and stared at that print for a long time. My mind tried to make it make sense. A bear print, maybe, distorted by the mud. But I'd seen bear prints before. This wasn't that. The proportions were wrong. The spacing of the fingers was wrong. This was a hand. I should have been terrified. I should have gotten in my truck, driven straight to the sheriff's office in Skycomish, and reported. What? That something impossible had visited my porch? That Bigfoot was real and stealing my leftovers? They would have laughed at me. Or worse, they would have sent someone out to check on the crazy widow living alone in the woods. So I didn't tell anyone. Instead, that night, I set out a full plate of food. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, steamed carrots. I set it on the porch railing where the break was, and I went inside and watched from the window until the sky went black and I couldn't see anything anymore. The next morning, the plate was empty, and there was another handprint in the mud. The first time I saw him with my own eyes, it was June 14th, 1988. I remember the date because it was my 41st birthday, and I'd spent the entire day alone, as I'd spent every day since moving to the cabin. I cut firewood in the morning, cleared brush along the overgrown trail that led down to the creek, and in the afternoon I sat on the porch and read a dog-eared copy of Lonesome Dove that I'd found in a box under the bed. The sun set late that time of year, nearly 9 o'clock, and the forest glowed golden through the massive tree trunks, the light slanting low and amber and almost otherworldly. I'd just finished washing the dinner dishes in a basin of creek water heated on the wood stove when I heard it. A low, resonant knock, like someone striking a hollow tree with a club. The sound echoed through the forest, deep and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. 3 times, spaced evenly apart, each one reverberating in my chest like a drum. I froze, my hand still in the dishwater, my heart hammered against my ribs. I'd read about this phenomenon, about how Bigfoot researchers believed the creatures communicated across long distances through tree knocks, using fallen logs or standing deadwood as percussion instruments. But reading about it in a magazine while sitting in a Seattle coffee shop and hearing it in the deep silence of the Cascade Wilderness are 2 very different things. The sound felt intentional, intelligent, and it felt close. I grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen table and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled like wet earth and cedar sap, and the faint sweetness of wild roses blooming somewhere in the understory. The forest was utterly still. No bird song, no rustle of wind, nothing. Just that heavy, expectant silence that makes the hair on your arms stand up. And then I saw him. He stood at the tree line, maybe 40 feet from the cabin, half hidden in the shadow of an enormous Douglas fir. At first, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain kept trying to reinterpret the shape as something familiar. A man in a costume, a bear standing upright, a trick of the fading light and shadow. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became. He was too tall, 8 feet at least, maybe more. His shoulders were impossibly broad, easily 3 times the width of a human man's. His body was covered in dark, reddish-brown fur that seemed to absorb the dim light rather than reflect it, and his arms hung long and powerful, the knuckles of his hands nearly reaching his knees. But it was his face that stopped my breath. It wasn't animal. It wasn't human. It was something in between. Deeply set eyes beneath a heavy brow ridge, a flat, broad nose, a mouth that was neither snout nor lips, but something that suggested both. And those eyes. They were watching me with an intelligence that was unmistakable. Not the blank stare of a deer or the predatory focus of a cougar. This was awareness. Consciousness. He was thinking. I should have screamed. Every instinct screamed at me to run inside, lock the door, hide under the bed like a child. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe it was because I'd been alone for so long that even fear felt like connection. Maybe it was because something in his posture, the way he stood very still, the way his hands hung open and unthreatening, didn't read as dangerous. Or maybe it was because in that moment, looking at this impossible being, I felt more awake, more alive than I had since Richard died. I did the only thing that made sense. I held up the plate of food I'd set aside for him. Roasted chicken thighs, boiled potatoes with butter, carrots from a can, and I placed it carefully on the porch railing. Then I stepped back, slowly, and sat down on the top porch step. We stared at each other. The light continued to fade. Somewhere far off, an owl called. Minutes passed. 5, 10, maybe more. I didn't move. Neither did he. I could hear my own breathing, could hear the faint creak of the trees settling in the cooling evening air. My legs started to cramp from sitting still, but I didn't shift position. I was afraid that any sudden movement would break whatever strange spell this was, would send him vanishing back into the forest like smoke. Then he moved. He came forward cautiously, each step deliberate and careful, his massive weight shifting from foot to foot with surprising grace. His hands were held slightly out to his sides, palms open, as if to show he meant no harm. I could see the details now in the last of the light. Old scars on his knuckles, the gray beginning to streak through the fur on his chest, the way his breath misted faintly in the cooling air. He smelled like wet dog and moss and earth and something faintly metallic, like old blood or rusted metal. When he reached the porch, he stopped. He was close enough now that I could have reached out and touched him if I dared. Up close, I could see the individual hairs of his fur, could see the way his nostrils flared as he scented the air, could see the deep amber color of his eyes catching the last rays of sunlight. He picked up the plate with hands so large they made the dish look like a child's toy. His fingers were thick and calloused, the nails dark and worn. He sniffed the food once, a deep inhalation, then began to eat. Not like an animal, no tearing or gulping. He ate carefully, methodically, using his fingers to pick up each piece of chicken, each chunk of potato. He chewed slowly, deliberately. When he finished, he set the plate back down on the railing, gently, as if he understood it had value and shouldn't be broken. Then he looked at me one more time. Our eyes met. And in that gaze, I saw something that changed everything. Recognition. He saw me, not as a threat or a food source or an obstacle, as another being, another consciousness. Then he turned and vanished into the forest without a sound, moving through the underbrush like water, impossibly silent for something so large. I sat on that porch until full dark, trembling, crying, and feeling more alive than I had in 2 years. For the next 6 months, he came every 3 or 4 nights, always after sunset, always when the forest was quiet. I learned his patterns slowly, the way you learn the habits of a wild animal you're trying not to frighten away. He preferred overcast evenings when the moon was hidden behind clouds and the darkness was absolute. He never came during a full moon, when the forest was bright enough to read by. And he never, ever came if there were other people nearby. Hikers on the distant trails, hunters during deer season, even the occasional logging truck rumbling down the old forest roads miles away. He could sense them long before I could hear or see anything. His survival depended on this caution, this hyper-awareness of human presence. I began to understand that every moment he spent near me was a calculated risk, a choice he was making over and over again. I started leaving food regularly, setting it out at dusk even on nights when I wasn't sure he'd come. At first, just leftovers. The last of a pot of chili, leftover roast with potatoes, bread and butter. Then I began cooking extra deliberately, making meals I thought he might like. Rich stews with venison or beef, roasted vegetables, fresh bread baked in the wood stove. I'd set the plate on the porch railing and wait inside by the window, watching the tree line, sometimes for hours. Sometimes he came alone, materializing from the shadows like a piece of the forest itself taking shape. Sometimes I heard others in the distance, other tree knocks echoing from different directions, answering his. I realized he wasn't alone. There were others out there, a family or a group, communicating in ways I couldn't fully understand. But he was always the one who approached, always the one who trusted me enough to cross that invisible boundary between his world and mine. By autumn, something extraordinary started happening. He began leaving things for me. The first gift appeared one morning in late September. A river stone, smooth and perfectly black, placed carefully on the porch railing exactly where I always left his plate. It was beautiful, the kind of stone you'd search a riverbed for hours to find, and it was clearly intentional. He'd brought it from somewhere, carried it here, left it for me. I held it in my hand for a long time, feeling the weight of it, the coolness, and I understood. This was reciprocity. This was relationship. A week later, there were wild mushrooms, chanterelles, bright orange and perfect, cleaned of dirt and arranged in a neat pile. Then a deer antler, still covered in velvet. Then a handful of perfectly ripe huckleberries in a makeshift basket woven from cedar bark. Each gift was thoughtful, carefully chosen. He wasn't just taking my food. He was giving back. In November, I decided to try something bold, something that terrified me even as I did it. I brought out 2 plates instead of 1, filled them both with beef stew and fresh bread, and I sat on the porch steps with my plate, eating slowly. At first, nothing happened. The forest stayed silent. But after 20 minutes, I heard the softest footfall, the faintest shift of weight, and there he was at the edge of the clearing. I didn't look directly at him. I kept my eyes on my food, eating slowly, pretending he wasn't there. After another 10 minutes, he came forward and sat. Not on the porch, but on the ground just below it, close enough that I could have reached down and touched the top of his head. He picked up the second plate and ate, and we sat there together in silence, the only sounds the scrape of my spoon and the soft smack of his eating. When we finished, he set the plate down gently and made a sound I'd never heard before, a low rumble deep in his chest, almost like a cat purring but deeper, resonant. Then he left. That winter, I named him Samuel. I don't know why that name came to me. It just felt right, old-fashioned, dignified, human. Giving him a name changed something in me. He stopped being it, or the creature, or Bigfoot in my mind. He became Samuel. A person. By the spring of 1989, I could read his moods like I'd once read the moods of the children in my classroom. When he was calm, his shoulders relaxed, and his breathing was slow and even. When he was nervous, his eyes darted constantly toward the forest behind him, scanning for threats I couldn't see or hear, and he stayed low, weight on the balls of his feet, ready to run. When he was content, usually after eating something he particularly liked, he made that rumbling sound and sometimes tilted his head back slightly, eyes half closed. He never made loud sounds near the cabin. No screams or howls like the ones reported in Bigfoot sightings. Just soft huffs, low grunts, and occasionally that deep rumble that I came to recognize as his version of a thank you. I began to understand something profound, something that went against everything the researchers and documentaries claimed. Samuel wasn't just intelligent in the way a dog or a dolphin is intelligent. He was emotionally complex. He grieved. I saw it in his eyes sometimes. a deep sadness I couldn't name. He feared, not just danger, but something deeper, something existential. And he hoped. I saw it in the way he kept coming back, kept trusting me, kept building this impossible friendship. And most importantly, he trusted me. Not blindly, not completely, but enough. Enough to sit beside me, enough to eat from my hand, enough to bring me gifts and accept mine in return. We were friends. Against all logic, against all possibility, a 73-year-old widow and an 8-foot-tall creature the world insisted didn't exist had become friends. The first real test of that trust came in the summer of 1991. It started with a rumor I overheard at the general store in Skycomish during my monthly supply run. A team of Bigfoot researchers, 3 men from a university in California with PhDs and expensive equipment, had set up a base camp 2 miles south of my property near Tonga Ridge. They'd been there for a week already, the clerk told me with barely concealed excitement, and they'd already recorded tree knocks and found fresh prints near the river. They had thermal cameras, audio recorders, motion-activated trail cameras, the whole works. They were serious, professional, and they were close. Too close. I felt my stomach drop to my feet. I paid for my groceries, flour, coffee, canned goods, kerosene, and drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. That night, I didn't set out food. I was terrified that the scent would draw Samuel in while the researchers were nearby, that they'd catch him on camera, or worse, corner him somehow. I didn't know what I was more afraid of, that they'd hurt him, or that they'd prove he existed and turn my forest, my sanctuary, into a circus. Samuel didn't come that night, or the next, or the night after that. 3 weeks passed, the longest 3 weeks of my life. The forest felt empty, haunted. I left food every single night, setting it out at dusk and checking it at dawn, but it sat untouched. Raccoons didn't even touch it. It was as if every animal in the forest had gone into hiding, sensing the presence of the researchers and their cameras and their intentions. I walked the trails during the day, calling softly when I was sure I was alone, leaving little signs the way he'd taught me through his gifts: stacks of stones, pieces of bread on stumps, arrangements of sticks that meant I'm here, I'm waiting, please come back. But there was no response, no gifts, no tree knocks, nothing. I was terrified they'd driven him away permanently. Or worse, that they'd found him, captured footage, maybe even caught him somehow. The thoughts spiraled in my head at night as I lay awake in bed, listening to the forest sounds and hearing nothing unusual, which was somehow more frightening than hearing something. Then, on a Friday night in early August, I woke to the sound of scratching at my door. Not the polite knock Samuel usually used. Frantic scratching, like an animal trying to dig through wood. I bolted out of bed, my heart hammering, and ran to the door. I could hear his breathing on the other side. Fast, panicked, the breath of something being hunted. In the distance, voices, men shouting to each other. Flashlight beams cutting through the trees, sweeping back and forth. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. Samuel practically fell inside, stumbling in his haste, his massive frame filling the doorway. He had to crouch almost double to fit, his shoulders brushing both sides of the frame. I slammed the door shut behind him, locked it, and killed all the lights. The kerosene lamp, the flashlight, everything. We stood in complete darkness, both of us breathing hard. The voices grew closer. I could make out words now, saw something moving. This direction. Get the camera. Flashlight beams swept across my windows. My cabin wasn't large, just one room, really, with a sleeping loft and a small kitchen area. Samuel barely fit. He was crouched in the center of the room, his head nearly touching the ceiling beams, his breath coming in short, terrified gasps. I could feel the heat radiating off his body, Could smell his fear sweat, sharp and acrid. Someone tried the door handle. The metal rattled. I held my breath, praying I'd locked it properly, praying the door would hold, praying they'd go away. "It's just a cabin," one voice said. "Probably empty. Old hunting shack. Should we knock?" "Nah, let's keep moving. Whatever we saw went north." Their voices faded. The flashlight beams moved away, sweeping through the forest in the wrong direction. Thank God. Thank every God. I stood frozen for another 10 minutes, listening, waiting to make sure they were really gone. Finally, when the forest had been silent for what felt like hours, I lit a single candle. The warm light flickered across Samuel's face. He was still crouched, still trembling, his eyes wide and white-rimmed with fear. And then he did something that shattered me. He reached out, and his massive hand, rough, calloused, impossibly warm, closed gently around my wrist, not grabbing, not restraining, holding. We stayed like that for a long time, connected by that touch, both of us shaking, both of us understanding how close we'd come to disaster. When I finally felt safe enough to speak, I whispered, "You're okay. They're gone." He looked at me with an expression I'll never forget as long as I live, gratitude mixed with grief so deep it had no bottom. Then he touched his chest with his free hand, a deliberate gesture, unmistakable, then pointed at me, then back at himself. "You. Me. Same." I understood. We were the same. Two beings who didn't fit in the world we were supposed to inhabit, hiding from the people who would destroy us if they knew what we were. From that night forward, everything changed. I stopped going into town except when absolutely necessary, and when I did go, I lied. When people asked about strange sounds, I said I hadn't heard anything. When they asked about tracks, I said it was probably just bears. When they asked if I'd seen anything unusual, I looked them in the eye and said no. My sister stopped calling. The few remaining friends from my old life drifted away. People in Sky Comish started calling me the crazy hermit woman who lives in the woods. Let them. I didn't care. Samuel needed me to keep his secret, and I would guard it with my life. The years blurred together after that. Seasons cycled, summers of long twilight and the smell of wild roses, autumns of chanterelles and huckleberries, winters of silence and snow so deep the cabin was buried to the windows, springs of trillium blooms and rushing snowmelt. Samuel came less frequently as he aged. I could see it happening, the same way I could see it happening to myself in the cracked mirror above my sink. The gray spreading through his fur, starting at his chest and creeping across his shoulders and down his arms. The way he moved more slowly, more carefully, favoring his right leg in cold weather. The deepening lines around his eyes. The weariness that settled into him like sediment. I aged too. My hands grew knotted with arthritis. My knees ached in the mornings. My hair went white. But every 3 or 4 nights, sometimes longer in winter, he still came. And I still fed him. We still sat together on the porch, eating in comfortable silence. Two old beings who'd found an impossible friendship and refused to let it go. I knew it couldn't last forever. Nothing does. But I didn't expect it to end the way it did. February 3rd, 2025. The coldest morning I can remember in all my years in these mountains. I woke before dawn to a sound I'd never heard before. A low, pained moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I knew immediately. Something was wrong. I threw on my coat over my nightgown, shoved my feet into my boots, and stumbled out onto the porch. The cold hit me like a physical blow, well below zero, the kind of cold that burns your lungs when you breathe. Ice crystals glittered in the pre-dawn darkness. Samuel was lying on his side on the porch, his breath coming in shallow, labored gasps. Frost had formed on his fur, white and delicate, making him look like he was already becoming part of the winter landscape. His eyes were open but clouded with pain. I dropped to my knees beside him, ignoring the ice soaking through my nightgown, and I took his massive hand in both of mine. His fingers were cold. Too cold. "It's okay," I whispered, tears already freezing on my cheeks. "I'm here. I'm right here." He looked at me. Really looked at me. The way he had that first night 47 years ago, when I'd set out a plate of chicken and potatoes, and chosen to see him instead of fear him. His chest rose and fell, each breath harder than the last. And then he spoke. "We remember." His voice was broken, hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably formed into words. Human words. English. My brain couldn't process it. I'd spent 35 years with him and never once heard him speak. I'd assumed he couldn't, that whatever he was, language wasn't part of it. "Remember what?" I choked out through my tears. "When we were like you." Each word came with immense effort, pulled up from somewhere deep and ancient. Long ago, before the hunts, before the fires, we were people. My hands tightened around his. "What do you mean?" "Your kind hunted us." His eyes found mine, held them. "Not animals, people. We spoke, had names, villages, children. But you feared us, killed us, burned our homes. We ran, hid, for generations, so long. We forgot. Language, forgot. Names. We became what you made us, animals, hiding." I couldn't breathe. The weight of what he was saying crushed down on me. "We hide because we remember what you do to those you fear." A tear rolled down his furred cheek, freezing before it reached his jaw. "We remember the hunts, the screaming, the fire. Every time a human sees us, we remember, and we run." Samuel. I couldn't form words. Couldn't think past the horror of it. His breathing grew shallower. His grip on my hand weakened. "Thank you, Margaret." He'd never said my name before. I didn't even know he knew it. You saw me. Not monster, not animal. Me. His eyes began to close. All I wanted, all any of us wanted, was to be seen. "I see you," I sobbed. "I see you, Samuel. I always have." The faintest rumble in his chest. That sound of contentment I'd heard hundreds of times. And then his chest went still. His hand went limp in mine. I don't know how long I sat there in the freezing darkness, holding his hand, sobbing into his fur. Hours, maybe. Long enough for the sun to rise and the temperature to drop even further. Long enough for my tears to freeze on my face. Long enough for my legs to go numb. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. I couldn't leave him on the porch. Couldn't let anyone find him. It took me 3 days to dig a grave in the frozen ground, a clearing deep in the forest where the old cedars grow thick and the humans never go. I buried him wrapped in my grandmother's quilt, the one she'd made by hand 60 years ago in Kentucky. I marked the spot with a cairn of river stones, black ones, like the first gift he'd ever given me. Now I'm telling this story because I'm dying too. Cancer. The doctor gave me 6 months, maybe less. And before I go, the world needs to know the truth. They're not monsters. They're not myths or animals or cryptids to be hunted and photographed and proven. They're people. They're what we forced them to become when we couldn't accept something that was both human and other. They hide because we taught them, through generations of violence and fear, that being seen means being destroyed. Samuel trusted me with his life and his truth. I will honor that trust until my last breath and beyond. His name was Samuel. He was a person, and he was not alone.